Before we begin, just take a moment to your safe here. There's nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to go, just let your body relax, let your thoughts slow down, and if you enjoy these quiet stories, you can gently support the channel with a like. It helps more than you think now, just let go and allow the story to carry you whenever you're ready, just listen. The edge of genetic engineering, designer babies and the ethical abyss, how will writing our DNA change humanity? Part 1 of Before Birth. The choice begins. There are some technologies that arrive like tools. A better scalpel. A sharper scan. A drug that works faster than the one before it. And then there are technologies that do something far more dangerous than healing the body. They move the argument upstream. They ask not how to save a life already here, but what kind of life should be allowed to arrive at all. That is where the story of so-called designer babies truly begins, and not with a mad scientist in a glowing lab, but with a quiet shift in medicine's centre of gravity. The question stops being, how do we treat this child? And becomes, can we choose, screen, or rewrite the child before the child exists? That shift is no longer science fiction. Human genome editing is real, and so is embryo selection. What remains uncertain is how far society will let those powers go. To understand the fear, you first have to separate two very different roads that people constantly confuse. The first road is somatic editing, changing cells in a person who is already alive so that it affects that patient alone and is not passed to future children. That road is no longer hypothetical. In late 2023, the US FDA approved Casgevy, the first therapy using CRISPR/Cas9 genome editing for patients with sickle cell disease. It later also became part of treatment options for transfusion-dependent beta thalassemia. This is not a designing offspring. It is medicine acting on a sick patient's own cells. It is radical, expensive, technically demanding, but it is recognizably therapy. The second road is heritable genome editing, altering eggs, sperm, or embryos in ways that can be passed down to future generations. This is the road that frightens ethicists, governments, and many scientists far more deeply. The World Health Organization notes that genome editing can involve somatic, germline, and heritable uses, and explicitly says the heritable form is generally considered to raise greater ethical concern. The reason is simple enough to state and difficult enough to live with. Once you alter the germline, you are no longer changing one patient. You are editing descendants who cannot consent and may carry the consequences long after the original decision makers are gone. That is why the phrase designer baby is misleading in one way and terrifying in another. It is misleading because the real first uses of reproductive genome editing would not likely be about eye color, height, or cinematic notions of perfection. The strongest arguments from proponents have typically focused on avoiding serious inherited disease in rare cases. The 2017 U.S. National Academies report and the 2020 International Commission report both discussed heritable genome editing primarily in the narrow context of severe genetic disorders, not cosmetic enhancement, and both insisted that no pregnancy using an edited embryo should proceed unless safety, precision oversight, and strict criteria are met, criteria that the 2020 report said had not been met. But the phrase is terrifying because history shows that technologies justified in the language of medicine do not always stay there. The moment a society becomes comfortable with selecting against one category of traits, it begins asking about the next category. First, the unburbled disease, then the elevated risk, then the predisposition, then the low probability disadvantage, then perhaps the trait that is not an illness at all, but simply considered undesirable by markets, parents, schools, insurers, or states. This is exactly why ethical concern has widened beyond embryo editing itself to include embryo selection, especially new forms of polygenic embryo screening that try to rank embryos by estimated risks for complex conditions such as diabetes, schizophrenia, hypertension, or breast cancer. Reviews published in 2024 and 2025 emphasize that such screening has expanded beyond traditional uses like aneuploidy or single gene disorders, while raising major scientific and ethical concerns. Pause there for a moment and picture the future in its least dramatic form. No secret bunker, no state breeding program, no robotic nursery, just a fertility clinic. A couple sits at a table. On the screen are several embryos created through IVF. Next to each one is a growing profile, chromosomal status, monogenic disease risk, maybe later polygenic risk estimates, perhaps predictive scores marketed as optimization, prevention, or preparedness. No one in the room has to say the words superior child. The software does the softening. It says reduced risk, better odds, more favorable profile. And that is how eugenic logic can return in the language of consumer choice instead of state coercion. Reviews of polygenic embryo screening have already warned that its appeal lies precisely in this softer framing, even though its predictive value remains limited and deeply contested. The true shock to the modern world came in 2018, when Chinese researcher He Jiankui announced the birth of twin girls whose embryos had been edited using CRISPR in an attempt to alter the CCR5 gene and reduce vulnerability to HIV infection. The reaction was immediate and global. Scientists, ethicists, and regulators condemned the experiment. Nature and Science both described it as having triggered international outrage, and Science reported that he was later sentenced to 3 years in prison. The reason the case mattered was not only that he broke rules, it was that he shattered the comfortable fiction that reproductive genome editing still belonged to the future. The future had arrived too early, in the hands of someone willing to gamble with children who could not consent. That moment changed the turn of the entire field. Before 2018, the debate often lived in conferences, reports, and hypothetical ethics panels. After 2018, no one could pretend that the barrier was purely technical. Human beings were already willing to cross it, and the scientific objections were not subtle. The 2025 Nature commentary, Human Embryo Editing Against Disease is Unsafe and Unproven, argued that even when framed as disease prevention, embryo editing remains far too risky and uncertain. The International Commission's 2020 recommendations likewise said no attempt to establish a pregnancy with the genome-edited embryo should proceed unless it is clearly established that precise genomic changes can be made efficiently and reliably without undesired changes, something the report says has not yet been shown. And this is where the ethical abyss opens. Because editing a future child is not like choosing a school or diet or a surgery the child can later reject. A heritable edit is built into the body's starting conditions. It enters the lineage itself. The U.S. National Human Genome Research Institute notes that germline editing draws the sharpest ethical scrutiny precisely because those changes can be passed on to future generations. And this good human rights framework goes even further, describing the human genome in a symbolic sense as the heritage of humanity, grounding the debate not just in safety but in dignity, common inheritance, and responsibility to future persons. That is why even people who strongly support gene therapy often recoil over reproductive editing, because the line between healing and authoring is morally explosive. When a therapy treats sickle cell disease in a living patient, medicine is intervening against suffering. When an embryo is edited, medicine is beginning to participate in authorship in not merely rescuing a person from illness, but helping decide in advance which traits may enter the world and which may be filtered out. Some ethicists argue that there may eventually be narrow and compassionate cases for this. Others argue that the logic itself is corrosive, because it turns children from gifts into projects and from persons into genetic portfolios. The debate is not only about safety, it is about what parenthood becomes when choice grows too powerful. And yet the road toward that power is not blocked by science alone. It is being widened by markets. Polygenic embryo screening is a warning here, because it shows that designer-baby dynamics do not require writing DNA at all. They can emerge through selection. If a clinic offers embryo ranking based on estimated future disease risks and perhaps one day even probabilities linked however weakly to height, cognition-related proxies, or non-medical preferences, then society can begin changing the genetic profile of births without ever touching CRISPR in the embryo itself. The 2024 Review in Human Reproduction update and later ethics discussion stressed that such screening has uncertain utility, population bias problems, and serious social implications, especially if it drifts from medical use toward generalized optimization. In December 2025, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine's Ethics and Practice Committees concluded that polygenic embryo screening is not ready for clinical use because its clinical utility is unproven and its ethical concerns are substantial. This is why the story is not really about one forbidden experiment in China or one dramatic future lab. It is about a slope. One end of the slope is easy to defend, curing a devastating disease in a consenting patient. Farther down is screening embryos for catastrophic inherited disorders. Farther still is screening for lowered risk. Farther still is screening for weak proxies and desirable probabilities. And beyond that, perhaps one day, lies editing itself not to heal a child, but to optimize the child before birth. This loop is not imaginary. What remains uncertain is how fast the culture will move down it, and which justifications will make each step sound humane enough to normalize. The deepest emotional danger is that the first steps will not feel monstrous at all. They will feel loving. Parents will say they are only trying to spare a child from disease. Clinics will say they are offering information, not coercion. Companies will say they are improving probabilities, not promising perfection. Regulators will say the technology must not be left to underground markets. Researchers will say the line between prevention and enhancement is not always clear, and each of those statements can contain some truth, which is exactly what makes the descent so hard to stop. So part 1 ends not with a futuristic nursery, but with something much more plausible and therefore more frightening, a fertility clinic lit softly like any other medical space. A screen full of embryos. A ranking system that promises reduced risk. A scientist arguing for caution. A company arguing for progress. A couple arguing with grief, hope and fear. And somewhere beneath all of it, the oldest and most dangerous temptation in human history returning in modern language. Not who deserves to live, but something smoother. Which child should we choose? Part 2 of the children of choice in the future we cannot recall if the science were the only problem. The story would be easier. We would simply ask whether embryo editing is safe. If not, we would wait. If yes, we would proceed carefully. But that is not the real shape of the danger. Because even if safety improved dramatically, the deepest ethical problems would remain. The current scientific position is already cautious to the point of warning. The WHO issued a governance framework and recommendations in 2021 because human genome editing raises ethical and social effects that cross borders. The Council of Europe stated in 2023 that there is a broad scientific consensus that current technology is not yet safe and effective enough to establish a pregnancy using intentionally edited germline cells or embryos, and that no country explicitly permits such use. The 2025 legal review likewise summarized the landscape by saying no country currently allows human heritable genome editing, even though regulatory detail differs across jurisdictions. That global caution exists for technical reasons. Yes, unwanted edits, incomplete edits, mosaicism, and certain long-term effects, but also because societies understand something profound. The first generation of edited children would not merely be treated. There would be precedents. Once born, they would normalize the idea that some human genomes may be intentionally redesigned before birth. Policy would no longer be arguing about possibility. It would be arguing about acceptable categories of modification. That is a much harder line to hold, and once that line moves, pressure will not come only from disease. It will come from inequality. The history of medicine is full of treatments that began expensive and unequal before widening, but reproductive technologies add a different sting. They do not merely distribute health unevenly. They can distribute starting conditions unevenly. If embryo selection or editing becomes a premium service, wealthy families will not just buy better care for existing children. They may buy statistically different futures before those children are born. Reviews of embryo screening ethics repeatedly warn about exactly this. Widening reproductive inequality, market-driven trait selection, and the risk that optional technologies begin to create cultural expectations around what responsible parents ought to choose. That is when the abyss stops being personal and becomes civilizational. Because a society can survive on equal incomes, it can even survive on equal education for a while. But what happens when inequality begins to feel biological in origin, even if it was built socially through access to selection and enhancement technologies? I imagine 2 children born in the same year. One was conceived naturally, or through ordinary IVF. The other was selected from embryos with lower estimated disease risk, perhaps later enhanced through methods judged safe enough for reproduction. Even if the biological advantage is modest at first, the social story around those children will be enormous. One will be treated as ordinary chance. The other as intentional optimization. And once societies begin sorting children into the chosen and the unchosen, the moral language around dignity starts to corrode. This is where the old word returns, even when people do not want to say it aloud: eugenics. Modern genome editing is not the same as 20th century state eugenics, and collapsing them lazy can obscure real differences. Today's technologies are often framed as voluntary, medical, market-driven, and parent-centered rather than openly coercive. But ethical literature on embryo screening and heritable editing keeps returning to eugenic concern for a reason. When societies begin ranking embryos, discouraging certain traits, or normalizing the avoidance of entire categories of human variation, they risk building a eugenic logic through consumer choice instead of law. The concern becomes sharper when the traits involved are not fatal diseases but disabilities, neurodivergence, or probabilistic risks tied to how society values different kinds of lives. That critique matters especially when disability enters the room, because many people hear the phrase prevent genetic disease and imagine only compassion. For disability, scholars and many bioethicists have long argued that systematic efforts to prevent the birth of people with certain traits can send a message about the worth of those already living with them. The issue is not simply whether suffering should be reduced. Of course medicine should reduce suffering, but whether society begins to speak as though some forms of human life are mistakes best edited away. Once technology and cultural prejudice start reinforcing each other, medicine can quietly become a sorting mechanism rather than a healing one. And then there is the problem of consent, which never goes away. A born patient can accept or refuse treatment. A future child cannot. The embryo cannot say whether it wants an altered immune system, altered disease risk, altered metabolism, or altered reproductive future. The descendants of that child cannot say it either. That is why so many governance efforts treat reproductive editing as ethically distinct from somatic therapy. The intervention does not stop at one person. It travels. Whose framework, UNESCO's human rights language, and the National Academy's criteria all reflect this deeper concern that heritable editing affects future persons who were never parties to the decision. Some advocates answer this by saying parents already make irreversible choices for children all the time. That is true, but the comparison is incomplete. Parents choose schools, neighborhoods, languages, medical care, and environments. These shape a child profoundly, but many can later be resisted, reinterpreted, or escaped. A germline intervention is not that kind of choice. It is built into the developmental foundation of the body and potentially into the lineage. It carries a metaphysical arrogance that ordinary parenting decisions do not. It says not only I will guide your life, but I will help author your biological starting script. Even so, the strongest argument in favor of moving cautiously forward remains emotionally powerful. What if editing could truly prevent a catastrophic inherited disorder in cases where no unaffected embryos are available? What if it could spare generations of suffering? What if refusing to use it later came to look cruel rather than prudent? This is why the debate does not collapse into easy moral certainty. The 2017 and 2020 National Academies linked reports did not say never. They laid out extremely narrow hypothetical conditions under which heritable editing might someday be considered a severe disease, lack of reasonable alternatives, robust oversight, multi-generational follow-up, public engagement, and demonstrated safety and precision. But those same reports were explicit that current conditions do not satisfy those standards. That combination of possible future pathway alongside a present prohibition is exactly what keeps the ethical argument alive. And while those arguments continue, another transformation is happening quietly in parallel. AI and large-scale genomics are making embryo ranking more computational. Deep learning systems are already being studied for embryo assessment in IVF, and recent discussions of polygenic embryo screening describe prediction systems that combine genome-wide data, statistical scores, and in some cases AI-assisted decision support. Even when the stated aim is implantation success or reduced disease risk, the underlying social effect can be the same. Embryos become data-rich candidates compared, sorted, and assign future probabilities. That does not make the predictions omnipotent, far from it. Reviews emphasize limited predictive value, ancestry bias, environmental uncertainty, and unresolved clinical benefit. But it does change the cultural grammar of reproduction. The embryo becomes legible to markets and metrics in a way earlier generations never were. This is what could change humanity most profoundly. Not one spectacular edited genius child, not one scandalous legal birth, but the normalization of genetic decision-making as part of ordinary family formation. Once people become accustomed to comparing embryos, the language of chance weakens. Children begin life not simply as arrivals but as outcomes of prior optimization. Love itself may begin to absorb that logic. Parents may feel pressure not only to welcome a child, but to justify why they did not choose a better one if such options were available. The tyranny of the possible becomes its own moral force. And there is another consequence almost no one escapes: genetic diversity. The wider the screening criteria become, the more social norms can start pruning variation. A trait tolerated in one generation may become stigmatized in the next if there is a test for it. A behavioral pattern once accepted as part of human range may be recast as preventable risk. This is not only a biological issue, it is a cultural one. Some variations are burdens, some are differences, some are both, depending on context, support, prejudice, and environment. Technologies that invite parents to optimize against risk can easily become technologies that narrow our tolerance for human difference. That is why governance matters so much here. Whose 2021 recommendations did not merely call for more science, they called for registries, whistleblowing mechanisms, stronger oversight, and broader public governance because the consequences of human genome editing will move across borders and generations. UNESCO's human rights framework consists that the genome cannot be treated merely as raw material for preference satisfaction. And comparative policy work shows that despite growing pressure for translational pathways, the world still broadly holds a line against heritable genome editing for reproduction. These barriers are not bureaucratic accidents. They are civilization trying, however imperfectly, to slow down before crossing a line it may not know how to redraw. But no barrier lasts on alone if culture stops believing in it. That is the final danger. If the public comes to see reproductive editing as merely the next logical extension of good parenting, then prohibitions will begin to look old-fashioned. If disease prevention bleeds into risk reduction, and risk reduction into enhancement, and enhancement into competitive parental duty, the ethical centre may move long before legislatures do. Then the question will no longer be, should humanity edit future generations? It will be, can any parent afford not to? And once a civilization begins asking that question, it is no longer just changing medicine. It is changing the meaning of birth. Children become less like surprises and more like managed launches. Inheritance becomes less like fate and more like editable architecture. Parenthood becomes less like stewardship and more like design. Human variation becomes less like a shared condition and more like a quality control problem. That is not a small shift in bioethics. That is a redesign of the human story. So what will happen if we keep moving? The honest answer is not that humanity will instantly split into science fiction casts or that edited elites will appear overnight. The more likely first transformation is quieter and more plausible. Medicine, reproduction, insurance, class, disability, and parental anxiety will begin tightening around one another. The technology will arrive unevenly. The language will stay compassionate. The market will move faster than moral consensus. And by the time society realizes that it has crossed from healing into selective authorship, the new logic may already be built into ordinary life. That is why this story ends at the edge, not beyond it. A scientist holds up a pet over an embryo. A regulator drafts a line meant to hold for one more decade. A parent asks whether refusing a test is irresponsible. A child is born carrying a choice they never made. And humanity, for the first time in its history, stands over its own genetic future with tools sharp enough to change not just who survives, but who gets invited to exist. The abyss is not that we might learn to edit DNA. The abyss is that we might begin to think of human beings as drafts.